Hello, and welcome to the Examined Life podcast with me, Kenny Primrose. This is the podcast where I explore questions with a range of leading thinkers that they believe we should be asking ourselves. It's an attempt to think about what it means to live deliberately within a culture which is not always well set up for human flourishing or the planet's flourishing. Today, I am delighted to be joined by the writer Michael Sacasas. Michael writes a popular newsletter called the Convivial Society. In our conversation today, we explore his question, what is it good to do for ourselves even when a machine can do it for us better or more efficiently, effectively, and so on? It's a fascinating conversation, and one I think is really relevant to how we arrange our lives, how we choose to live in this moment. It has an awful lot to say to us if we want to live rich and meaningful lives. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Unfortunately, the video failed, so it will just be text you can read along with or listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. As ever, please subscribe, like, comment, start a conversation below. That would be appreciated. Thank you for watching. I'll hand over to the conversation now. Reading your posts, you throw up a lot of questions. I know you've got 41 questions that you think are wise to ask when we're thinking about our interaction with technology. But there's various other ones that are implicit and sometimes explicit in your writing. The nature of this podcast is to distill some of your thinking into a question which currently preoccupies you or you think would be generative and helpful to be asking. So maybe we can start there. What is the question that's preoccupying you at the moment that you think we do well to explore?
I don't have this question formulated in the most elegant way possible, but I'll try it this way. What is it good for people to do, even though a machine might be able to do it just as well? The background here is the promise that whether it's AI or other forms of technology will automate or displace or take over some task that would have otherwise been performed by a human being. And what are the criteria that we might use to evaluate whether this is a good thing to do, even if the answer is sometimes, well, the machine can't do it as well as the person. And then maybe some threshold is crossed and all of a sudden it can. If we allow for the fact that there are tasks that some machine, whether AI powered or not, will be able to accomplish it in a way that passes muster by a human standard, is it nonetheless good for a person to be involved in this kind of activity? Does that question itself make sense?
It makes very good sense. You mentioned AI, and what comes to mind very quickly are large language models taking over thinking and writing and things like
Yes.
that. But we could look into history to start talking about central heating and basic technology that has displaced certain functions.
Yeah.
And so maybe before we get into some of the modern kind of challenges and technologies that were around, what are the things that come up for you looking at history and you think, here was a technology that made us more efficient, quicker, freed up some leisure time, but actually cost us something that we haven't really acknowledged fully yet? Is there anything that comes up
Yeah.
from the last few hundred years for you?
Sure. My thinking goes to an example in the work of Albert Borgman. Albert Borgman, who recently passed away within the last year, was a philosopher of technology, taught at the University of Montana for many years. I find him particularly helpful in giving us categories and concepts to approach this question. There's an example he uses in his work that I think is helpful here. So he talks, you mentioned, it came to mind in part because you mentioned, I think, central heating. So he invites us to consider what was involved in heating a home prior to central heating, where you would use a hearth or a fireplace or some other kind of wood burning technology to provide warmth. And what he's trying to do is show us a contrast between what he calls focal things and devices. The promise of a device is that it will make something easier, more controllable, less effortful, safer. So it presents us with a kind of commodious surface that's easy to use and manipulate, as opposed to whatever it is that it's displacing. But the focal thing is the thing that engages us. It may require a little bit more work, effort, labor on our part. It may not be entirely without risks, but It gathers people, it focuses attention, it engages the user. He considers the work involved in heating the home, which may involve cutting wood, preparing that wood for the fire, someone bringing that wood in, lighting the fire, maintaining the fire, and how that involves all members of the household. A household of parents and children would involve various members contributing to the performance of that task. Now, of course, we set a thermostat, push a button, and all of that work is displaced and taken over by central heating. Obviously, a lot easier. It's something we can now put out of mind. I imagine the next step after Borgman wrote this in the 80s, we might now imagine an automated Nest type thermostat device, which makes it even further out of mind. So the question I think that's worth considering here is that these are specific. People have to think about them in specific context and given their own particular situation in life, right? So what Borgman is helping us see is some of the differences that we might miss, some of what is lost. And he is not prescribing, right? So this is in part why I tend to prefer questions rather than prescriptions. We might arrive at different calculations of what is good for us to do given our particular circumstances. So it's not as if Borgman is trying to prescribe something universal. Everybody must have a hearth. If you don't have a hearth, somehow you're morally failing as a human being. Rather, I think he's trying to help us think about some of the goods that were conditioned around the presence of certain kinds of technologies and the practices that they encouraged, and to ask whether the ease and efficiency that were promised when these are automated or mechanized in some way or form, whether it is an good to opt for efficiency or whether there's some costs that are not just a matter of binding a community together or a family together, but that it is good for us to have a certain skill set, certain skills that we can have that make us feel competent. There's mastery over the world, sufficiency that is helpful for us psychologically, even just to flourish as human beings, a sense of satisfaction, be able to do certain things for ourselves. And again, that I want to stress that configuration of what those things may be may vary person to person, family to family, community to community, but we require some things like that. And so when we begin efficiency, comfort, safety, security, we delegate tasks, we lose skills because we outsource, whether those are physical or intellectual. Some effect may be unconsciously depriving ourselves of friction, challenge, the need to apply ourselves, the intellectual, physical engagement to some degree may be a component of our flourishing. That's one example. We can then think of all sorts of other possibilities. Much modern technology from the industrial age forward has been premised on this idea of time saving. And the question is how much time is actually saved? The classic work here is a text by the historian Schwartz, Ruth Cohen, and she has a book called More Work for Mother, written in the early 80s, examining the promise of labor-saving technologies from the early 20th century. Often these didn't deliver on their promises because in some cases they multiplied tasks that weren't possible before. I think of email in a contemporary setting, how fascinating it must have been in the early years of email to think, oh, I'm saving so much time. I don't have to write this out by hand. I can type it out quickly. It's not taking several days to arrive. I don't have to put a stamp in it. I don't have to go to the post office. Here we are wondering where all our time went. Many of us spend most of our days in email because that threshold of efficiency actually created a higher quantity of work, even though it made some of the processes easier.
Didn't feel rambling at all. There was so much in it. I get your point on the law of induced demand. When washing machines and dishwashers were invented back in the 50s, the level of cleanliness and expectation went up
Yes, right.
for a household. It did free them up. As you say, this idea of getting to the end quicker, whether it's warmth or cleanliness, what you lose along the way is, as Borgman points out, huge, but hard to quantify. It's the fact
Mhm.
that you're a contributor to the household, which gives you a sense of belonging rather than
Yes.
a consumer. I think of shopping, presumably it's the same in the US. In the UK, uh, I think many people get it delivered to the door. The community that happened when you went to the shops, or the
Yeah.
exercise you got bringing
Yes.
back the shopping from the shops. It makes me think of Marshall McLuhan's questions. What is this technology extending? And then when it's overextended, what is that amputating? Those amputations are often harder to see. I suppose the question is, what is good for people to do, even if it can be done by a machine, presupposes that efficiency and the end product are not the goal, even though they are invariably the explicit goal. The goal is to have warmth, to dry your clothes or whatever.
Mhm.
And so it requires you to think, what are you trying to achieve if you choose the less efficient or the less productive option?
Yes. I think the underlying point here is that we are focused on those outputs, and we tend to think that the means are a matter of indifference. Right? This is an important part to highlight. As long as I get output X, it doesn't matter how I achieve it. Now, in some cases, that may very well be the case, but I don't think we should assume that it is necessarily the case. One example that's now in the air, in the cultural air a little bit more, because large language models are able to do these cognitive tasks, or to produce essays, to produce writing on the platform Substack, populated by a lot of writers. Their notes feature social media aspect of the platform. I see a lot of writers addressing this question, trying to think through the implications, trying to deliberate or debate when is it appropriate to use generative AI in the writing process, et cetera. And so I don't know that I want to suggest that it is always improper to use it, or it is always wrong morally or with regards to the craft to use this. But we need to ask what makes the difference. In terms of writing, some have suggested you can use this tool to write the first draft. You give it a prompt, you feed it the information, maybe the thesis statement, but you write the first draft, then you review it, you revise it, and still passing through your intellect, so to speak. But the question that comes to my mind when I think about that is that very often I learn what I think about something through that drafting process. And it's not pretty. It can be laborious, right? It can mean sitting down for a while and writing some stuff and feeling like, wow, this was really not great, scrapping it, starting again to get at the idea, to develop the argument, learn that the argument maybe is weaker than you imagined at the outset. I know it has been my experience that I begin writing about something. I'm surprised by where I end up at the end of it. What this is suggesting is that the process itself is valuable, right? You might say the end goal is you just produced 1,000 words that your editor is requiring, or that your teacher is requiring, or whatever the case may be, that your employer is requiring for ad copy or whatever. But there's something involved in the process of arriving at those hypothetical 1,000 words that is valuable. I think about another example often used in these conversations, washing dishes. The dishwasher makes that relatively simple. There's maybe a genuine question about use of resources, thinking economically, thinking in terms of the environment, the water usage in a community. But then if somebody were to ask, what do I gain by doing dishes by hand? And someone might say, I've heard people say this. They will say, I have the option of using the machine, but the nature of that work is such that I can become very thoughtful through that process. It allows me to think. It's one of these tasks that is in that sweet spot of occupying our mind in such a way that it sustains reflection, right? We don't have to give the task our full attention. It supports the ability to be 15 to 20 minutes in a state of relative internal calm, right? So that we're able to think well. Is that valuable? I think that's valuable. So, and anecdotally, I've heard people use the time for meditative thinking or even prayer. This goes back to the observation you made at the outset of this question. Often, one, they're things we wouldn't have thought about until they're taken away and replaced. They are very difficult to quantify in various cases. It would be hard for me. I'm not quite sure how I would approach quantifying the loss of a few minutes of reflection that might accompany a task like washing dishes. I've also heard people say, again, to bring in a communal dimension, that a young married couple found that was a very productive time for them. One would wash, one would dry, and they would have good conversations around that time. And that may not be the case for everybody, but for some people, there's something lost in automating that work. So I think it just requires us to be thoughtful about what is happening in the process. What are the things that be part of the end goal are dependent upon doing the task in a certain way. The means are not interchangeable, I suppose.
You mentioned earlier something about delegating these tasks, and it's something you've written about, like life cannot be delegated. And life exists in these mundane tasks, not things we have to get through to be people of leisure or pleasure. Do you think this is a broad misconception that when you get through the stuff of life, the quicker you do it, the more time you'll have, you're going to get to do what you were made to do? There's something slightly
Yeah.
like Hellenistic philosophy
Yeah.
about this. I'll just get to sit and stroke my beard. Is that an idea that you think we need to disabuse ourselves of?
I think that's always a poignant question to ask when somebody is trying to sell you something that will save you time. What exactly am I going to do with that time? What am I being liberated for? This is a question of ends, not just a specific task, but human well-being, human flourishing, the good life. You mentioned the Hellenistic idea that we find happiness when we're able to enter a state of undisturbed contemplation. And this via contemplativa, the contemplative life, is the good life, as opposed to the via activa, the active life. There's versions of that are found in classical philosophy. There are versions of that are found in religious traditions. I don't want to discount this altogether. I think contemplation is a good. We could probably all use more time for contemplation, especially if you have religious or moral reasons to pursue that. So it's not as if I want to discard that idea altogether, or say that life should be all labor. But I think there's a genuine correction we need to ask ourselves when the labor is the point. And I think this is easiest to see in cases where care is involved for other human beings. I have two children. The oldest is about to turn 10. So their infancy and toddler years are not too far behind in their rearview mirror. And I think of how much technology now around infancy, childhood is sort of exists in the space of helping you to monitor or to outsource your attention, your care for a child. There are one dystopic variation of this and the other spectrum of life, a commercial for an Amazon device, device connected with Facebook, where it would provide companionship for the lonely elderly individual. It was essentially a chatbot of some sort. In these cases, the ideal is that there is human companionship involvement, that the parent is involved with the child. And there are questions and discussions to be had about the way in which some of these roles have been gendered and maybe unjustly distributed under certain circumstances. With that acknowledgement, I think it's good for us to spend our time in care for others. If the system and it promises to outsource that care, then I think we need to question whether there's not something lost at the relational level, right? Isn't this the point, right? Isn't this the point as a human being to be involved in people's lives and in the lives of our loved ones, to accept some of these burdens as it's not burdens in the pejorative sense, but things that are privileged to carry and to bear for one another, for our communities, for our families. I think that's one way of thinking about this that most people recognize, but then there are less morally charged cases where we can ask, what exactly am I being freed up to do? Is it just to become a passive consumer of entertainment, goods and services, without any real involvement in the world of people and things in such a way that I would feel a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of fulfillment? That idea that it's always good to save time, to outsource labor, is something we should at least not take for granted and interrogate a little bit more carefully.
There's something in what you mentioned on care of the elderly or your children. Have you seen the film Her? Joaquin Phoenix falls in
Yes,
love
that's
with
right.
an operator.
Yeah.
There's a kind of disgust impulse to that. And I sometimes wonder whether that impulse is telling us something, revulsion to something dehumanizing that is it felt rather than thought. If you could rationally care for an elderly person and stop them feeling lonely, wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that solve the loneliness problem in some way? Yeah, it would, but something doesn't sit right.
Mm.
My neighbors have recently purchased this device. It's a very fancy bit of kit. And it basically does everything for you and cooks you an amazingly well balanced meal. It tells you what to do. You throw it all in the pot, and you basically have saved yourself the labor of cooking. They love it. It's one of those pieces of technology which I feel like is exciting to get. The de-skilling is one part, and also just that process, chopping onions and
Yeah.
chatting to someone while you chop onions and smelling it. There's something I think maybe I'm getting at the disembodied nature of these technologies that seems harder to put your finger on as a problem. but it feels like a problem.
Yes. And struggle to defend the thing that you feel intuitively is good and important here, right? And there are, I keep wanting to flag all of these tensions because I'm a working parent, put in your hours at the job and you come home and cook a lot of meals. And it could feel like, wow, it'd be wonderful if I could just come home and not think about that and just have some technology to easily do this for me. That promise is very old, right? I think of in the 60s or 70s, the promise of what here in the States were called TV dinners. So you get these prepackaged meals, right? I think probably the quality has come up a little bit since then. What I've discovered is I wrote about this maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, somewhere in the newsletter, realizing at first being a little frustrated also by the fact that my kids who were a little bit younger wanted to be involved. And in a sense, that makes the whole thing a little less efficient. But happily, I realized this is actually an opportunity. This could be a gift that I'm granted, right? To be able to spend this time with my daughter, time to talk, think over the day, to teach her, to learn myself, to teach her skills she enjoys. I may not always have the time to savor every sort of tactile encounter, right? But I do think there was a Episcopal bishop from the last century who wrote a book about cooking, food, and theology. He talks about sitting with the onion and reflecting on its nature, allowing all of your senses to engage with it. And so at one level, maybe somebody listening might think, well, this is sort of ridiculous. And certainly even he says, you don't do this every time, right? You should do it once. And I think it's about the nature of our embodiment, that it is good for us. I think of this definition of technology, and I can't remember the source right now, but someone said that modern technology is a way of so arranging the world that we don't have to experience it.
Yeah.
And I think then we wonder, why am I unhappy? Why do I feel like I have a purpose, meaning? Is there something good given the sorts of creatures, beings that we are with a body in this world of flesh and blood? With a world that in many respects has obviously countless challenges, right? But so much beauty and goodness in it. But we're not sufficiently attentive to it so as to receive what it does offer us, right? In that moment with various foods, with ingredients, there's this kind of common, it's almost like a meme that you hear sometimes, right? That the average modern person has spices in their cabinet that would make a medieval king blush. I've often thought that the rejoinder to that is, do we even care and take the time to appreciate, to enjoy that? Because we're so rushed and focused on efficiency.
You're listening to the Examined Life podcast with me, Kenny Primrose. Today, I'm in discussion with Michael Sacasas, who is helping people like me and you think carefully about the way technology is shaping our lives and our characters. What you were just saying, Michael, made me think about camping. Camping is full of friction and difficulty. Everything is hard and you get wet and tired and you sleep badly. So I enjoy camping and I enjoy wild camping, partly because it makes you very present.
Yeah.
There's something about the process that engages you in what you're doing. There's no shortcuts here. There's this lovely essay by Laurie Lee called Appetite, where he talks about the TV dinner thing, the fact that our appetites are always blunted. We don't know what it's like to drink water from a stream, so what that feels like to parched lips anymore. And the anticipation, this is true with food, but it's true with everything we have too much of, too readily available. It blunts our longing for it and we fail to appreciate its goodness.
I think you mentioned that life cannot be delegated. That's a line from Lewis Mumford's essay where he talks about the magnificent bribe that we're offered. Modern technological society offers you all of these wonderful things that by historical standards are luxurious. Few human beings have ever enjoyed this level of access to transportation, safety, instantaneous communication, entertainment on demand, et cetera. His wording is very eloquent, and I won't get it quite right, but at one simple cost, which is that we don't ask for anything other than what the system provides, and that we accept all that the system provides for us. That speaks to the nature of human desire in our present sort of techno-economic milieu. Our wants are programmed and conditioned in such a way that we may be missing out on a kind of quality and texture and richness of life that is inseparable from a measure of effort, involvement, engagement, struggle to some degree, and maybe even periods of measured deprivation. I hesitate to say that because I don't want to suggest that the good life is a life of deprivation where people don't have enough to eat, people don't have access to medical care. This is always the kind of thing you hear is like, well, you want a life without penicillin, right? And the point is never to go back. This is not about a romantic vision of the past. It is simply about asking, how can things get better? What are we missing? If we've developed a world in which we have a surfeit of goods, at least some, and those, again, not always justly distributed, but a surfeit of good for many people, and yet we find ourselves unhappy, dissatisfied, something is off. Okay, so what can we do not to go back, right? But what corrections, what things need to be reconfigured? What have we maybe unwittingly traded away? You imagine through the early process of development of the modern technological milieu, you have things that are just making life tangibly better, alleviating suffering. At that point, you're probably not asking, what am I losing? You're losing pandemics and childhood mortality and all sorts of, it's great, lose those things. And it's after a period of reflection, you realize along the way, there were some other important things that maybe we have let go of unwittingly. Is there a way not to revert or to somehow seek for material deprivation, but to find other ways of incorporating practices and experiences that will give us a sense of competence, sense of purpose, that will bring communities together rather than isolating individuals, that will not make us mere consumers. And of course, we'd be resisting a lot of the uh, underlying logic of modern economies, which find increasing ways to make us dependent on their goods and services, even beyond just satisfying basic needs and providing for basic goods. There's a lot to unpack there, particularly on the front of human desire and the kind of experiences that we are offered and whether they are as rich as we imagine them to be.
Lots of dense and interesting ideas there. Your point about the logics of the world at the moment are not going to be the way to deal with our ennui or whatever, because they're only driving us in one direction. Arguably, it feels like we're moving towards universal basic income and having our work lives taken over. A significant conversation to be had around what that would do for us to have our work removed. But where do you find reasons to be hopeful within our current context? There's one way of looking at things that's quite bleak. You can
Mhm.
see where everything is headed. It's got a very stubborn logic to it. The people
Yeah.
who hold the levers don't seem like they've got any interest in changing them. How can communities ask this question on a bigger scale?
That's a great question and one I'm inevitably asked or some version of it. I think my impulse is to sort of bracket the question of scale. I wouldn't presume to say this is how the world will be saved. There are enormous issues of immense scale confronting us in various guises and dimensions. If you do see the whole apparatus of society bent in one way, it's hard to imagine how does it get turned around. And invariably, I find myself wanting to say there's a question of time frame. How long would it take to do that? What is the time frame in which we're thinking when we ask the questions, what is to be done? Maybe we just need to extend our horizons and think about things in terms of generations, turning the ship, as it were, in terms of generations. That's part of it. But I think it has to start at some level with choices that individuals, families, and communities at a human scale are going to make differently. If you ask me what I see that is hopeful, I think part of it is that there is a growing conversation around these sorts of questions, right? A growing willingness to question whether this, as Mumford put it back in the 1960s, this magnificent bribe was in our best interest, right? Whether there are not some ways in which we ought to refuse the bribe. Just becoming aware of how this technological infrastructure shapes us, right? This is something where I think I've seen a huge shift in public consciousness, even in the 10 to 15 years that I've been writing about these questions, right? People do not just necessarily assume that all new technology is going to be good and beneficent and helpful to them. I think it begins with a more critical attitude, more critical thinking about the nature of the technological milieu, and then beginning to make more informed and constructive choices I think there's been a lot of conversation, at least here in the US, about smartphones. That's been going on for a while, but I think it's saturated the cultural conversation a little bit more. I think Jonathan Haidt's recent book has had a lot to do with it. I think we should ask these questions. There's something about the way we feel tethered to this particular device that many of us feel intuitively is off or disordered. So we begin to sense there are consequences. These are not just neutral tools. It's not just another way to make a phone call. There's something else going on here. I should think about what limits I might want to put on it. Some people may decide that they don't want this instrument to be a part of their lives anymore. Just that consciousness of the power of certain tools and technologies, whether they're devices or systems, to think more critically about it and to be prepared to say no, a refusal, or to better negotiate the terms on which we allow these devices into our lives to the degree that we have agency, all right, to the degree that we have agency. And I think not everyone has the same degree of agency to make these kinds of choices, even in small ways in their lives. So we should, in whatever way possible, make it so that an increasing number of people are able to make these choices. There are those that will pursue solutions or regulation at the governmental level. That's fine. My thinking is always for the individual who is going to wake up tomorrow morning and with regards to his or her personal life, the life of his or her family, their small community, we'll have choices to make and we'll not be able to wait for the next round of legislation or for the tech companies to wake up and become more conscious about their harms. That's not right now the way forward to empower individuals to make choices, but to lead with the good, to say, I'm always saying by how the plot of Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 begins with the protagonist being asked, "Are you happy?" It's a very powerful question. Are things going well for you? There are many reasons why they may not be. If we look around and say, I'm this sort of person that has a relatively decent job, sheltered, I have basic needs, but I'm not happy. What is off? That willingness to think through the question of the good life and to recognize that your technological kit, if you will, is a part of that conversation and that we need to be more reflective about it. That more people are coming to that place is the beginning of a larger cultural shift that might take time to play out.
I hope you're right. I definitely noticed the same kind of thing. Ivan Illich, you quote him as saying, hospitality is where he finds hope. I was curious to know more.
The face-to-face encounter, learning that we're all human again. There's so many dimensions to the things that are not well with us as a society. Part of it is the way that social media over the past decade has mediated our perception of the other. And there in particular, thinking about the face-to-face encounter being very powerful and necessary, because when we're mediated by social media and we see the most outrageous elements of what we think of as our political other, our cultural other, it's very easy to construct a false and destructive picture of the social body. I was thinking of this even when you were talking about the Jane Jacobs thing about those little micro encounters that we have when we live on a city block and we see the same people. We know them. They're distinct people. They're different than us. And there's something humanizing about the total effect of those kinds of encounters.
The weak ties, I think psychologists call them. The weak ties.
Yes.
Yeah, not insignificant part of life.
When you're talking about food and how you can order a whole meal, never leave your house. You don't even have to see the person who delivers it anymore. Here, somebody will knock on your door and then you open the door, the food's there. You haven't seen a single human being involved in the process of preparing that. Those encounters, I think, that we're increasingly outsourcing so that the only people we ever see are the people we are within our affinity group. We lose all the kind of virtues and skills required to relate to others who are not like us, I think. That's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. I think it was Helena Norberg Hodges' nice line. She said, our arms have grown so long that we don't see what our hands are doing anymore. And that kind of detachment and disconnection is a moral thing, right? Jean Twenge points out that technology is the driver in generational shift. It would be interesting to think of whether a generation might grow up after us who are defined by their refusal to engage in certain types of technology. I wonder, from your knowledge, is there precedent for technology, the Luddites smashing up their sewing machines or whatever? Are there any cases that you can think of where actually people have said, this is not good for us, this piece of technology and efficiency and whatever, and we're going to reject it. Obviously, you have communities like the Amish who are the poster boys of this en masse, such that it doesn't achieve some kind of hegemonic dominance in the way we do life.
Yeah.
Or are we looking for a world first here?
So I think the Luddite example is interesting because it's always telling when Luddite is used as a casual slur, right? There's such a
Hmm.
Luddite, but meant pejoratively, with the idea being that these are just people that hate technology, right? But I think we know the cases that it wasn't the technology per se, right? It is the way they were being de-skilled and economically deprived. They might have been fine with introducing these new technologies in a way that still honored their labor and allowed to provide for their families. I don't want to pass over the Amish too quickly, though, because this goes back to the previous question you asked me in my long-winded answer, which is just the realization that we have to ask some questions, right? About 10 years ago, I wrote a post about the tech-savvy Amish, and they got to this place faster than the majority of the population. Their distinctive characteristic isn't that they reject technology. Their distinctive characteristic is that they're willing to think about technology before adopting. They think first and do adopt, but they will adopt on the condition that their communal goods are not put at risk by the adoption of the new technology. Broadly speaking, this is the way these communities tend to operate. They're not just trying to freeze life in the late 19th century. They're trying to preserve a certain form of life for themselves that they value. And they're not willing to throw it out the window because somebody has a new device to sell. And so they have a kind of communally instituted process of weighing whether it's going to be good to introduce a new technology or not. They have people who we might think of as early adopters, deploy this technology in a limited way to evaluate it, and then as a community decide whether to enthusiastically accept this new technology, accept it with clearly defined limits, or refuse it. It's that willingness to think through and not just adopt first, ask questions later, often when it's too late. It is a model for us. I'm the American psyche, right? The American culture and technology's place in it. America's been a very techno-friendly culture. We have a lot of faith in new technology. The default has been to think that, of course, a new technology is good and it's going to be good without complications. There's a minority position. You can find it in some of the romantics in the early 19th century, the arts and crafts movement, both in the UK and here. I think there are people who have said, hold on, there's a way of life that is at risk here. There's something inhuman about these new arrangements. But I think the majority has always been very enthusiastic and has not recognized the need to even think. So the fact that many of us are now recognizing that need, that we ought to think. One of the framings that I think is very helpful about the introduction of smartphones over the last to 12, 15 years, particularly for small children, is that we basically ran a society-wide experiment, but without the consent of those we were experimenting on, because that is the nature of the impact of these tools. Maybe a willingness never to do that again, right? Or maybe the recognition within some critical mass of the society that that wasn't a good thing to do. That itself, I think, is grounds for hope. One example in recent years is Google Glass. A company developed these glasses, you may remember, like circa 2012, 13 maybe. And there was a pretty strong reaction to it. There was a cultural pushback against it. And maybe the argument is these simply failed because they hadn't reached the requisite level of technological sophistication. Facebook and Ray-Ban have been issuing similar sorts of augmented glasses that maybe are making better inroads. But that collapse of that Google project, when there was so much talk about how inevitable this was, this is the future. I remember in particular, I think it was the CEO of Evernote at the time saying, in 5 years, it'll seem barbaric to live without these things. And so, of course, that's the rhetoric of people who have something to sell. But that's one recent case where what some described as an inevitable technological progression was refused. It's only in the timescale of human history that we've learned to think these things through. That doesn't mean we have great places of public discourse to adjudicate. This is the advantage of the Amish to have, right, relatively small scale communities with deliberative processes. We may not have a scale of community where we can make these choices. Maybe the school, the local school board is one. Maybe the church is one. Maybe the neighborhood is another, where we can have meaningful input, feedback, communal decision making. If it's just the individual and the corporation or the individual and the state, then there. But if we can find smaller scale human organizations where there can be a process of deliberation and choice and a community that comes together against a shared vision of the good life. I think that that would be the way forward.
That's really helpful. I wonder if I can draw together some of the strands of our conversation. We've been exploring this question of what is good for people to do, even if it can be done by a machine.
Mm.
And the question is, well, what do we mean by good? It's not just efficient or
Yes.
the product, it's the way you're formed by doing it, all the additional goods that come with the process. And pausing to reflect, like what's being lost, is crucial in this. I wonder, as you apply this question to your own life and you have young children, are there practices or habits that you have instituted that are a way of living out this question?
That's a great question. To affirm, what is the good? I didn't make this very clear in the essay I wrote, or I should have spent more time with it. When I invited us to echo Mumford's rallying cry, life cannot be delegated. What do we mean by life? What sort of life? That's an important question to ask. You're asking what, for many people, ultimately are deeply moral questions or philosophical or religious. And obviously, there are going to be competing narratives and claims about what that life entails. And I think that's why the smaller scale community is an important context in which we can ask those questions, right? Because my answer may not be the answer that others may give. And that's an important component. In my case, when I talk to parents about this, or a parent just happens to ask me, what do you do? For kids, they're worried. Often they're worried. And often they're worried that their kids are spending too much time on a screen or something like that. It was a worry, but not unjustified. And I think the first thing I want to say was, what is the good that you're after, right? That we should lead with the good. I think it's just good practice in general, right? To not simply say, I feel this is bad. I want to limit this. I want to react. It's reactionary in a sense, right? For children, this is less than helpful because it just feels arbitrary. There's just this thing that mom and dad don't let me do, or whatever the case may be. But if we can say, these are the good, beautiful things that we want, these are the things that will instill virtue or a high degree of real enjoyment, fulfillment. Again, those are contested things, right? One way of looking at it is not what are we cutting out, although there is some of that, but what are we being intentional to do? So to get outdoors, right? To be out in the world. And this is, depending on where you live, can be a little challenging. I'm fortunate in that it doesn't take a ton of work for me to get out to a place where we're going to be in the midst of trees, walking on a trail, encountering flora and fauna in interesting ways. It's been important to me to learn the names of these things so that
Hmm.
I don't just point and say, oh, there are some trees or here are some birds, but to be able to recognize, to name, to tie closely together this web of attention and consciousness and language. This is empowering for people as they become more familiar with the world that is their home. I try to do this for myself. I grew up in the city by and large, and this is not part of my upbringing. I'm having to learn and impart this to my own children. We're driven by efficiency because we have crammed so much into our lives that we have to operate like a machine as a household to make it work. So this sometimes entails just saying no to certain opportunities, weighing them and not assuming that more is always better with regards to our family life. Having times of quiet, encouraging that to some degree, reading a lot. As I described earlier, taking this time to prepare a meal together, I think is important. It's become a little ritual in my household. I think it's something that will bear a lot of fruit in important ways. So the gist of all of these is just ask, what are the good things that we want? And then I can say, how does spending this much time on a device help us with that? How does a certain tool or device or practice help us get these good things that we want for ourselves, that feed our relationships, feed our commitment to our neighbors, to the world, to help us enjoy the world? And if we find that the tool, the device, it's not conducive to those ends, we can say, maybe that's not something we need. It's not something we want. It's a kind of dense network of these sorts of questions and judgments that touch on all sorts of dynamics within a household. That's just a glimpse of how I try to think about these things. What are the things that will really nurture my relationship with my children and their relationship with the world and others? How can we not let our tools get in the way of that? If there are tools that will help us do that better, then we embrace those.
Michael, I've so appreciated, especially ending on these really practical, concrete bits of advice. But there's a huge amount in what you've said and what you write about on your Substack that is provoking people like me to pause and think about how we interact with technology. And that question, what is the good that we seek? So I'm massively grateful for that. Is there anything that you would like to plug?
I think the Substack is where I do most of my writing and thinking, and it's an important part of my work. Folks will check that out. That'd be great. But thank you. I appreciate the kind words. All that results from my writings that people are just thinking a little bit more deeply about these questions. That's good in my view.
It certainly serves me, and I know it serves many others. Thank you for your work with that. Michael, thank you so much for giving up an hour of your time. Very generous of you.
Oh, my pleasure. Happy to. Great conversation.
And that almost concluded my conversation with Michael Sacasas, though I did sneak in one last question before signing off and stopping the recording. I think his answer here is worth including and finishing on. Ivan Illich, you quote him as saying, hospitality is where he finds hope. I was curious to know more. There's something very interesting about that as a statement.
The face-to-face encounter, learning that we're all human again, to recognize because there's so many dimensions to the things that are not well with us as a society. Part of it is the way that social media over the past decade has mediated our perception of the other. And there in particular, thinking about the face-to-face encounter being very powerful and necessary, because when we're mediated by social media and we see the worst and most outrageous elements of what we think of as our political other, our cultural other, it's very easy to construct a false and destructive picture of the social body. I was thinking of this even when you were talking about the Jane Jacobs thing about those little micro encounters that we have when we live on a city block and we see the same people over and over. We don't know them very well, but we know them. They're distinct people. They're different than us. There's something humanizing about the total effect of those kinds of encounters.
Yeah, weak ties, I think psychologists call them. The important
yes.
weak ties.
Yes,
Yeah. It's a not insignificant part of
absolutely
life, I think.
Yeah, it was when you were talking about food and how you can order a whole meal, never leave your house. You don't even have to see the person who delivers it anymore. Somebody will knock on your door, the food's there. You haven't seen a single human being involved in the process. Those encounters, I think, that we're increasingly outsourcing. We lose the virtues and skills required to relate to others who are not like us.
In an age of loneliness and tribalism, it's hard to overstate the value and need for hospitality in helping us to connect with and humanize those living in our communities who we barely know. One thing that machines will never be able to do is create human connections and communities. It takes people to do that. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this conversation with Michael Sacasas. I really valued his insights and will be thinking more carefully about the values at stake when I'm tempted to hand over human tasks to machines. Next week, I'll be in conversation with the influential psychologist Peter Gray. We'll be discussing the conditions for healthy psychological development and why they are so lacking in today's culture.
The question has always been stimulated in part by my observation that over the course of my lifetime, beginning in the early 1950s until now, we have seen a continuous decline in children's mental well-being. Obviously, we are doing a poorer job with every decade in supplying for children what they need to develop well psychologically. And what do we need to do? How do we do a better job? What are we doing now differently than was done in the 1950s when children, by every measure, were far happier, far healthier psychologically than they are today?
You can find out Peter Gray's perspective on that next week. Until then, I wish you all well. Thank you very much for listening. As ever, all your reviews, comments, listens, emails are much appreciated. Best wishes.